In fact, the opposition to U.S. policy in the Arab world is so strong that very large numbers of people in the Arab world, sometimes even majorities, think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. Okay, now ask yourself, if you're a leader of one of the Western imperial powers, do you want governments that are democratic in this region, which will reflect public opinion? The answer is obvious. Therefore, it is obvious that the Western powers will do anything they can to prevent democracy in the Arab world. It's also obvious that the states, the governments, their spokespersons, the intellectual community will write passionate articles and speeches about how much they love democracy, how much they want democracy everywhere, including the Arab world. Now, that's also predictable. That's the way the great powers behave. They have a class of people called intellectuals who produce passionate statements about the nobility of the state and so on and so forth. But it's typically quite divorced from their practice. In this case, far divorced from their practice. So what has the practice been? Well, in the Arab world, I mean now, what's called MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, in that region, the states that are most important to the imperial powers are, of course, the ones where there's oil. So, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Emirates, basically that region. That's where the major oil supplies of the world are. Iraq, and Iran, of course. But these are the places where the Arab Spring would be really dangerous, because democratic revolutions there might move towards something that actually Nasser threatened, which made him an enemy of the West, namely to use the resources of the region for its own people and their development, and not for the interests of the West and Western corporations. And that's pure heresy. And that's why the West turned strongly against Nasser. And in fact, that's the origins of the U.S.-Israeli relationship in its current form. It traces back to Israel's crushing of the secular nationalist movement in 1967, and its support for Saudi Arabia as the center of Islamic extremist religion, which has always been supported by the West against secular nationalism, which is considered much more dangerous. And in fact, if you take a look at what happened in the Gulf region, the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, even the slightest effort to join the Arab Spring was quickly crushed with not a comment in the West. That's just fine. We don't want that. There was a little bit of commentary about Bahrain, but that's only because it became so obvious you couldn't totally ignore it. But mainly, the regime was praised and supported for putting down the uprising. Eastern Saudi Arabia, where there was considerable conflict, Shiite area, and where most of the oil happens to be, there the repression was quite harsh, and it's continuing, but with no comment in the West. That's the way it should be. In the case of Tunisia and Egypt, the Western powers supported the dictatorships fully as long as they could. Tunisia's French protectorate, so France was more or less in the lead. They supported the Ben Ali dictatorship very strongly, to an extent that was actually embarrassing to France, because one of the French cabinet members who went to visit Tunisia on a vacation, famous vacation resort for the French, right in the middle of the uprising. The place was practically blowing up, and she went there to visit for a vacation, and France was still strongly supporting the dictatorship. Well, she was thrown out of the cabinet. That was too much. But they supported them as long as they could, and then turned to trying to control the result. In Egypt, the most important country, it was pretty much the same. The British and the Americans were in the lead there. Supported Mubarak fully till the last minute, till the army turned against him. When the army turns against your favorite dictator, you can't support him anymore. At this point, there's a routine reaction. It's a game plan which is carried out over and over again. If I had time, I could list you a dozen recent cases where the same procedure is followed. If your favorite dictator is in trouble, support him as long as possible. If it becomes impossible, maybe the army turns against him or the business classes turn against him, then send him off somewhere. In Egypt's case, send him to Sharm el-Sheikh. In the case of Duvalier in Haiti, send him to Paris with half the treasury in his jet plane that you provide for him. And the same in case after case. And then try to restore the old system as much as possible.